Okay, thank you everyone. Thanks everyone for joining us today. And today we have the honor of having Dr. Pranab Bardhan with us. And Dr. Bardhan will talk about the topic, Universal Basic Income in Post-Pandemic Poor Countries. It would be an audacity for me to try and introduce Dr. Pranab Bardhan. It will take a full 3-credit course to properly introduce him and his contribution to economics, but we still try. Dr. Pranab Bardhan is a professor of graduate school at the Department of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. He was educated at Presidency College, Kolkata and Cambridge University, England. He had been at the faculty of MIT, Indian Statistical Institute and Delhi School of Economics before joining Berkeley. He has been visiting professor fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge, St. Catherine's College, Oxford, and London School of Economics. He held the distinguished Fulbright Siena Chair at the University of Siena, Italy in 2008-09. He was the BP Centennial Professor at London School of Economics for 2010 and 11. He got the Guggenheim Fellowship in 1982. About his contribution to economics, he has done theoretical and field studies research on rural institutions in poor countries, on political economy of development policies, and on international trade. A part of his work is in the interdisciplinary area of economics, political science, and social anthropology. He was chief editor of the Journal of Development Economics for 1985 to 2003. He was the co-chair of the MacArthur Foundation funded Network on the Effect of Inequality on Economic Performance for 1996 to 2007. Dr. Bardhan is the author of 16 books and the editor of 14 other books, and author of more than 100 journal articles, including in leading economics journal. Some of his books in development economics are absolute Bibles. He has also contributed essays to popular outlets like New York Times, Scientific American, Financial Times, Digit, Boston Review, Los Angeles Review of Books, Economic Times, Times of India, Bloomberg, Quint, Hindustan Times, Economic and Political Weekly, Anandabajar Potrika in Bengali, to name a few. From 2018, Dr. Bardhan has started writing a periodic column for a New York-based blog, 3 Quarks Daily. And with this, I now hand it over to Dr. Bardhan for his lecture. It's over to you, Doctor.
Thank you, Chitrakalpa, for this generous introduction. And thanks in general to the Jindal School for inviting me to give this lecture. And thanks to everybody who's listening in. This is, of course, a strange way of giving lecture for me and listening for you in different parts of the, in being completely in different parts of the world. It's midday for you. For me, it's quite late in the evening in California. Be that as it may, the topic has been announced as Universal Basic Income in Post-Pandemic Poor Countries. I will, in parts, primarily talk about India, but most of my talk would be for generally applicable to general poor countries as well, other poor countries as well. Let me start. So in the pandemic period, in different countries, in fact, I would say nearly 100 countries in the world have announced programs of cash assistance for relief during the pandemic. India has also announced one, but probably among the different developing countries, India's is probably one of the most stingy, very small compared to other countries, the cash assistance part. I'm not talking about the food distribution part, it's the cash assistance part. So a lot of people have said, since cash assistance program is quite big now in many countries, particularly developing countries, why not take this opportunity to graduate from cash assistance to universal basic income, which is a kind of giving cash. I'm not quite satisfied with this demand right now, because having a universal basic income requires a lot of preparation, institutional preparation, political preparation, and fiscal preparation, etc. And it takes time. It cannot be done overnight. Also, one has to be clear, not all cash assistance is universal basic income. Cash assistance in the context of most countries under the pandemic has been to poor people. Universal basic income, by definition, is universal. It's for everybody. So it's quite different from the cash assistance programs that we are seeing in different parts of the country. Let me then now talk about universal basic income as such, which is, as I said, is a universal grant. It's a universal unconditional grant. And this idea is actually an old idea in Western countries. Let me very briefly tell you a bit about its history. In fact, it's more than 500 years old. It was first mentioned in Thomas More's famous book, Utopia, 1516. But there, he didn't develop it that much, but it's actually after a few years, his friend, Johannes Vive, developed it a little bit more, the idea. Then in 1797, Thomas Paine elaborated on this idea. So you can see how old it is. First in the 16th century, then we are now in the 18th century. In the 19th century, this was very elaborately talked about by Charles Fourier, the French socialist. And these are the socialists about whom Marx wrote about. Marx used to call, in fact, Marx discusses Charles Fourier, and he calls such socialists utopian socialists. Although, as far as I remember, Marx didn't discuss universal basic income as such. But Fourier inspired another economist of the 19th century, famous economist, John Stuart Mill. In fact, John Stuart Mill's famous book, Principles of Political Economy, which I think came out around 1848, the second edition of the book, by that time he had read Fourier. And the second edition, he goes and discusses this idea of universal basic income. So that's in the 19th century. In the 20th century, Bertrand Russell, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. talked about this idea. Then three Nobel laureate economists, Frederick Hayek, James Mead. By the way, James Mead was my PhD supervisor in Cambridge, England. And then the third Nobel laureate economist is Jim Tobin, the American economist at Yale. He did not write academic articles on it, but he put it in the presidential campaign of George McGovern in 1972, and Tobin was advising him, and this was included as a promise as of a demo grant. That's the name that was given, a universal grant to everybody. Of course, McGovern lost that presidential campaign. Since then, various Green parties in Europe have taken that up. And right now, all over the world, there are different experiments going on. Many experiments in different parts of the United States, some experiments in Canada, some experiments in Finland, and many other corners of Europe. It's being tried out. But these are all rich countries. And I'm going to talk primarily of poor countries. And I'm going to talk about one or two experiments in poor countries a little later. On a country level, it's been tried out in Iran in the beginning of this last decade, and then in Mongolia. Of course, in both Iran and Mongolia, it was funded by essentially natural resource money, Iran, oil in the case of Iran, and I think it's bauxite, copper in the case of Mongolia. In fact, in the United States, there is one state or province where there is a universal basic income for quite some time, since I think 1980s, and that state is Alaska, where also because of essentially oil and gas money, which funds it. Let me tell you about my own intellectual trajectory in pursuing this idea. I have been involved in an international group of scholars, primarily social theorists. For the last 40 years, we meet once a year. We present each other's work, one another's work. And in that group, this group has some economists, some sociologists, some historians, some legal scholars, and so on. In that group, there's a political philosopher named Philippe Van Parijs. He's a Belgian political philosopher. He is one of the major advocates of universal basic income. He has been a major advocate for universal basic income for at least 30, 35 years. But so I was quite aware of this idea for a long time, particularly through Philippe. But his idea was primarily, the exposition was primarily with respect to developed countries. And I thought this is an idea I think is somewhat unrealistic for developing countries. So I did not, at that time, that's what I thought. Maybe it's too expensive for us. I didn't pay that much attention. The more I thought about this later, I realized that this is really a good opportunity to explore this idea for poor countries. And I worked out a simple back of the envelope calculation showing that it is actually quite feasible in a country like India. The first time I gave this exposition, I remember in a conference in Delhi in 2010. And then the next year, 2011, March, I think, I published an article in Economic and Political Weekly, which I think, as far as I know, was one of the earlier cases of advocacy of universal basic income in India. So that's how I came to it. I'll talk about the back of the envelope calculations a little later. Now, in the context of rich countries, particularly now, a lot of people, including some of the famous tech entrepreneurs in the United States, in Silicon Valley, promote the idea of universal basic income. Particularly, they're worried about the robotization, digitization of work, so that many usual kind of work, not just for working classes, even for work for professional middle classes, their work will in near future be done with the help of artificial intelligence. So there is a lot of worry. How will these people then get to earn anything? And in that context, the tech entrepreneurs have suggested universal basic income. In fact, in this last US presidential primary, the Democratic primary, one candidate, Andrew Wang, his major platform was a universal basic income for the United States. But the problem for rich countries, I'm not going to, as I said, I'm not going to discuss the case for rich countries much, but the one big problem, which I'm going to say is less of a problem in poor countries, is money. How we're going to fund it. For example, even very simple calculations show that if you want to give, for America, if you give everybody $10,000 a year, which by the way is below the poverty line, just $10,000 a year to everybody, that will eat up most of the budget. At least 2/3 of the budget will go that way, which of course will be are prohibitively high. So that is a major opposition in rich countries to the idea. There are other opposition. I'll come to talk about opposition in a few minutes. For poor countries, whenever I mention universal basic income, I find people automatically take this as an anti-poverty program. I want to emphasize, I'm not looking at UBI, Universal Basic Income, as an anti-poverty program. First of all, as I already told you, it's not only for the poor. Universal means universal to everybody. But of course, the poor will also get it, and that will be a large part of the poor's income. The reason it is not an anti-poverty program, if some people say, why don't you give this income only to the poor? Problem, as we all know, there are a lot of targeting problems. To find out who is poor and who is not is a big issue. Indian bureaucracy quite often concentrates itself in excluding people to find out who's poor, who's not, etc. And that takes quite a bit of resources. It's also given a lot of scope for corruption and all that. Targeting in a country where we don't have an idea how much income people have. Targeting, so means testing is quite often out of the question. So targeting has huge problems. Sometimes, oh, by the way, I should also mention that one of the programs which Prime Minister Modi started just before 2019 election was the PM Kisan plan, which is giving some kind of income, I think 6,000 rupees per year, to all farmers, which is not just to the poor, to all farmers. So in that sense, it's not just anti-poverty program, but again, it's not universal. Farmers is only about what, 45%, 40 to 45% of the population. So it's not universal. Again, just before the 2019 elections, Congress Party came out with a program of a minimum income program. I think they called it Nyaya. So essentially the idea is if your income falls below a certain minimum income, they will top it up to bring you up to minimum income. And of course, that was just before the election and they lost the election. But the idea is quite infeasible because again, to top up an income, you need to know people's income. And we have very little idea. In fact, India officially doesn't even have a survey of income because in a country where the informal sector is very large, self-employed people are very large in numbers, it's almost impossible to find out what exactly their income is. And when you don't know what their income is, people will obviously have an incentive to understate their income so they can be part of this top-up program. One of my points is that one reason I don't want to think about is the anti-poverty program is that even people, those who are above the poverty line, large number of them are economically insecure, even though they're above the poverty line. I would say if nobody really has no idea because the government doesn't publish the data anymore, but today what the poverty, how many people are below the poverty line, but roughly say 20%, 25%. Of course, with pandemic, it must have gone up. But if you take the 25%, if you take the next 50% of people, so that means 25 to 75% of people, many of them are economically insecure. They face all kinds of risks. If you're a farmer, you face weather risks. All families face health risks. Already we know there's a lot of data that every year, even though you are above the poverty line, you can fall below it if the main earning member of the family falls ill. So that's a health risk, There are job loss risk. You can lose your job. So there are, I'm calling it all kinds of brutal risks. And of course, this has been exacerbated by the pandemic. Large numbers of people have lost jobs in the pandemic, after the lockdown, in the wake of the pandemic. The other argument people give for the UBI idea is that while anti-poverty programs primarily address only the poor, since universal basic income goes to everybody, at least the middle classes, there'll be some political support, although that is not my major argument. I look at UBI as a fundamental human right for minimum economic security, particularly important in poor countries where there is often no social insurance. In rich countries, at least, there is some social insurance. Even in the United States, where these social insurance programs are weaker than in Europe or Canada, even in the United States, there are unemployment benefits, and then there is social security for old age, and there is Medicare, which is for health. Large numbers of people in India do not have that security. And that's the majority of people among the working people. More than 80% of the people we know are in the informal sector with no social insurance of any significant one. In fact, if you think about it, the reason I'm thinking of it as a fundamental human right, if you think about it, in 1948, United Nations had this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you read that list of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to which India is a party, many countries have signed on to that Universal Declaration. One of the basic human rights is this, they didn't call it economic security, they called it social security. But this is what they have in mind, minimum economic security. So it's already, in some sense, it's a UN recognized fundamental human right. And I'm looking at UBI from that point of view. One problem that is always brought up to me said, you're going to give it to everybody? You mean you want to give UBI to Ambanis? My answer is yes. I'm giving it to Ambanis as well. I want to give it to Ambanis as well. So let me explain that with an analogy. Do Ambani, because I'm looking at as a basic minimum citizenship right. So if Ambani is a citizen, then he or she should be Ambani. If anybody in the Ambani family should have the right to have this money. Just as, for example, Mr. Ambani has the right to get police protection as a citizen. You might always say, well, he has so much money, he can hire thousands of guards, private guards. And so why do you have to give police protection to him? My answer is, as a citizen, he's entitled to minimum physical security, which the police will enforce. He may not need it, so that's a different issue. He has the right. Similarly, he may not need the UBI, but as a citizen, he has the right to get. So in that sense, I'm looking at as a right rather than part of an anti-poverty program, etc. This has also very important implication for the labor market. Because, for example, in India, if you have a government job, you have some security of this kind. You have pensions, you have health benefits, etc. But most people are not in the formal sector. As I said, more than 80% are in the informal sector, so you don't have it. But even those who are in the formal sector, they know that if they lose their job, then they lose not just the job, but all these benefits, pensions and health benefits, etc. They lose, that becomes insecure. So and this is the same case in the United States. United States, those who have jobs have health insurance. But those who don't have jobs don't necessarily have that. Of course, now Obamacare is a small bit for the uninsured. So if you have UBI, either in the United States or in India, then the particular job becomes less important. In a sense, if you lose a particular job, that's less traumatic because you don't lose these other benefits. Because those other benefits you get anyway as part of a universal scheme rather than connected with your job. So this has very important implication. So for example, just to give you an example, in fact, even recently, there's been discussion on labor laws in India. And the government is trying to change the labor laws. Now, why are trade unions so opposed to changing labor laws? Because they are worried about job security. And one of the reasons job security is so important, losing a job is so traumatic, because there's nothing to fall back upon. UBI provides this fallback option. And so that's why it's a very important implication for the labor market. I think labor reform will be easier if workers have this fallback option. Let me now talk about some special factors. Those factors that I mentioned are more general. Special factors in poor countries justifying UBI. First point I've already mentioned, so I'll skip. The first point is essentially because targeting and means testing are difficult in poor countries. Secondly, and this point is important in India, politics of redistribution is often centered in countries like India. The politics of redistribution is often centered around group-specific or individual-specific patronage, like job reservation. Reservation, of course, is a politically sensitive issue in India. Italians have something called lottizzazione, which essentially means jobs for the boys. Again, as part of jobs given as part of a political patronage program. Then in India, we have, and elsewhere, we have disbursement of subsidized private goods, food, fuel, fertilizers, credit, etc. Now, this diverts policy emphasis away from public goods. So if you spend so much money in subsidizing private goods, you have less money for public goods like electricity, like railways, like ports, roads, and things like that. And all of these public goods can improve productivity and benefit everybody, whereas those private goods subsidies benefit only a select group or select individuals. So in a sense, the benefits are much more widespread. So UBI, like other universal programs, like universal healthcare, universal pensions, etc., can thus mitigate the prevalence of clientelistic favors dispensed by politicians. So it's no longer a part of a political patronage program if everybody is entitled to it. By the way, I should have mentioned when I mentioned about the Ambanis, I mentioned why Ambanis should also be entitled to it. They may not take it, but they're entitled to it. One point that I forgot to mention, that if you give it to Ambanis, in any case, Ambani's tax rate is high, so much of it will come back to the government anyway. But that's a small point. The main point for me is a citizenship right. Then I've already mentioned that majority of workers in poor countries, unlike in rich countries, are in the informal sector. And here again, I want to go back to the labor market issue. one reason the labor movement is weak in countries like ours is that the labor movement is fragmented because of this formal-informal division. Majority informal and a small island of formal workers. So that divides the labor movement. And therefore, when the labor market, the laborers are fragmented, labor movement is weak, and therefore their bargaining power is low in India. And particularly because of this formal-informal division. A collective demand for UBI, as with other universal benefits like universal healthcare, can serve as a bridge between the two types of workers and strengthen the labor movement. So suppose both the informal workers and the formal workers have a common demand. So then the two movements on that kind of a platform can come together. So UBI can also act as a bridge. And it's gratifying to note that, of course, informal workers do not have organizations quite often, but the largest informal worker association in India is SEVA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. And it's gratifying to note SEVA for many years has been in favor of a universal basic income. And in fact, one of the early experiments of universal basic income was done by SEVA in some villages in Madhya Pradesh. And they found good effects. And so remember, I talked about experiments in rich countries. SEVA's experiment is one of the experiments in India that one should keep in mind. I'll talk about a much bigger experiment in another developing country a little later. Then the next argument in favor of UBI has to do with women. Unlike in many, of course, unlike in rich countries and unlike in many other developing countries, in some developing countries, India included, so countries in South Asia, West Asia, and North Africa, it is an unfortunate feature that the majority of women do not participate in the income-earning labor force. In India, the data tell you that now three-fourths of adult women are not in the income-earning labor force. They don't have any income. They have zero income. They work very hard, mostly domestic work or other family-related work, but they don't have any formal income. And that one of the side effects of that is huge, namely that lowers women's status in the family. So just imagine if every month in these women's who do not have any income, a bank account every month, a UBI is deposited there. This can go a long way in boosting their existing low autonomy and status within the family, and it will activate their agency. So to me, it's a big female empowering effect that UBI has, which a lot of people do not emphasize, but to me, it's a very important effect. A related issue where also quite often women are involved. There are many occupations in India which are particularly stigmatized, like manual scavenging, garbage collecting, sewage cleaning, sex work, etc. There are a whole lot of stigmatized occupations. Now, quite often people do this work even though the rest of society look down upon them, is because they have no other alternative. My argument is that UBI can provide them an escape ladder. If they still want to do those work, that's fine. But at least you have an escape ladder. If every month you are entitled to a certain income. Even beyond socially stigmatized work, UBI can be a great relief for the stark livelihood uncertainties faced daily by the vast numbers of the self-employed and the marginalized casual and migrant workers, and will help them in seeking better jobs, and those who are self-employed in getting more profitable investment. It will also enhance their bargaining power against the traders, the middlemen, the contractors, the employers, the creditors, and the landlords they encounter every day in pursuing their livelihood. Let me now, I've give you arguments in favor. I'm now going to give you some counter arguments, arguments against. So I'm going to tell you about 4 general kinds of opposition to the idea of UBI. Many common people, particularly those with strong work ethics, as well as some paternalistic leaders, say that UBI will encourage laziness. If money comes from the government, you'll become lazy. This will develop an attitude of taking from society but giving nothing in return, and a possible inclination of some recipients to blow it up all in drugs and alcohol. So this is one kind of opposition. I have an answer to it, but I'll come to those answers a little later. So then that's one opposition. Second, opposition from fiscal bureaucrats and conservative economists, as it may break the budget. How are we going to fund it? It's going to require a lot of money. So I'll come back to that too. This is a second opposition. Third, even otherwise favorably inclined social activists who want to help the poor, they're worried that this may act, UBI may act as a ploy to undermine existing welfare programs, particularly when they are working reasonably well. So for example, in fact, my friend Jean Drèze is one of India's most famous social activists. He has been opposed to UBI. And I've talked with him on this, he has written on this. So essentially he thinks that once you have UBI, the other programs like food distribution programs, Enriga, etc., they will be slowly be dismissed, will be eliminated. So that's what his worry is. He called it UBI maybe a Trojan horse. So that's the third kind of opposition. I'm going to talk about an answer to this also. And the fourth opposition, that if you get money to finance this UBI, there are other good candidates for spending that money. Like, why not spend it on education? Why not spend it on health and infrastructure, which are all very serious problematic things in poor countries? So UBI may not be the first priority. So that's the fourth opposition. Let me take these objections issue one by one. First of all, the argument about people will get lazy. So by the way, those of you who are economists know that this on the work, leisure, choice, there is, when your income goes up because of UBI, say, there's an income effect, there could be a substitution effect, but in the case of UBI, substitution effect is zero because it doesn't operate at the work-leisure margin. But there can be an income effect, namely, as your income goes up a little, you may work a little less. The income effect. So my answer is, the incentive to indolence argument may be used against any income improvement for the poor. You can always say that about any anti-poverty program. You can say, well, their income is going to go up, they're going to work less. Is that an argument against anti-poverty programs? No. And similarly, it should not be an argument for UBI, against UBI. But more than that, In recent years, there have been quite a few experimental studies on the effects of cash transfers to people in developing countries. The largest experiment, which actually is still going on, largest and longest lasting one has been the ongoing study in 40 villages in Kenya by this charitable organization called Give Directly. They give the villagers a very substantial income grant, and for the last more than 10 years now. And they're finding experimentally, they're measuring the effect. They find no systematic evidence that cash transfers discourage work or encourage use of drugs or alcohol. This is, by the way, also the finding in the Madhya Pradesh study of Seva that I told you about. They also don't find this any effect of that kind. In addition, let me give my own view on this. My own view on the possible work disincentive effect is that, if anything, the poor are often overworked in backbreaking, oppressive work. And it will be better if they, particularly women, can work a little less. So I'm not bothered if they work a little less from the kind of work they do. This laziness argument is usually a ploy by the rich, because they also, the poor are poor because they're lazy. So it's part of that, which I don't at all subscribe to. Let me now come to the issue, which is a big issue, is how are you going to fund it? Now, I did an illustrative fiscal exercise for this, for India, in my first work in Economic Political Weekly 2011, I told you about. I have modified that exercise with more recent data. So let me briefly tell you, this is not in the slide. I'm going to tell you very quickly. So I'm going to say that we can fund a UBI, a decent, not a full UBI, a decent UBI supplement by doing the following three things. Number one, many of you may or may not know that in India, of course, I think most people know that there are a large number of subsidies the government gives, both the central government and the state governments. But what is less known is that a very large part of these subsidies actually go to the better off people. So let's call these better off subsidies to better off the regressive subsidies. And now there are estimates available for this. So NIPF, National Institute of Public Finance and Policy, they have estimated, the latest estimate I've seen is for 2015-16. And they've estimated these regressive subsidies come to a total, and this is central subsidies plus state subsidies, implicit subsidies plus explicit subsidies taken together, to about nearly 6% of GDP, 6% of GDP. That's number one. Let's suppose we could take those. Number two, in most central budgets, in the appendix, there is something called revenues foregone. These are tax concessions mainly given to corporate sector. They're called revenues foregone. How much is it? The latest, I think in the 2019 budget, if I remember right, it came to about 6.2% of GDP. 6.2% of GDP. Now, some of these tax concessions are quite necessary. So, for example, some concessions are given to import duty exemption if that good is used in export, etc. And those are necessary ones. So I'm not taking all of it. 6.2% of revenues foregone to the corporate sector, to companies mostly. Let me take 1/3 of it. 2/3 still be there. 1/3 of it, let's add 2%. So number one, the first one gave me, the regressive subsidies part gave me 6% of GDP. Now add 2% of GDP. The two together come to 8% of GDP. Then I'm going to ask for extra 2% of GDP of fresh taxation. Not right now, because of the pandemic, the economy is low, but since, as I said, UBI is not immediate for in the intermediate term, 2% of fresh taxation. Which kind of fresh taxation? India has zero taxation of some items like wealth. India has zero taxation of wealth. India has zero taxation of inheritance. India has, of course, zero taxation of high agricultural income. India has relatively low taxation of capital gains. India has relatively low taxation of local property taxes. And of course, you can think of some other taxes. I don't have time to go into them. Let me mention one thing here, particularly when you're thinking of wealth taxation and inheritance taxes. India, some of you may not be aware, and if you want in the question answer period, I can give you more data. India is one of the world's most unequal countries. Even the household survey data, the National Sample Survey collects, the wealth data that we have, net asset data. If you measure the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of inequality, today our Gini coefficient of wealth is in the Latin American range. And Latin America is widely known to be one of the world's most unequal regions. And yet, this extreme unequal wealth regime we have, wealth taxation is zero. Inheritance tax is zero. So there is, I think, a lot of scope for fresh taxation. I could go into more details. So let me take 2%. So 8% plus 2 is 10%. This 10% I'm going to spend on 4 items: health, education, infrastructure, and the 4th is UBI. How much on each depends on the priorities at that time. Different governments may have different priorities. Now, let me make a rule of thumb. Let me give 1/4 to each of these 4 items. 1/4 of 10% of GDP, if I give to UBI, is 2.5% of GDP. And you can make a back of the envelope calculation. 2.5% of GDP, you can give a universal basic income of about 20,000 rupees each year to each family. It's not much, but it's not insignificant either. So it's a decent, moderately decent universal basic income supplement, which is possible to give. This is more illustrative exercise. Since my time is running out, let me say that the way I described it to you, it also takes care of the 3rd and 4th objection. The 2nd objection was fiscal feasibility, and I've just given you an example why it's fiscally feasible. The 3rd objection was that it's a ploy that social activists make. But remember, in doing this, I'm not touching any of the existing programs. NREGA, food distribution, public food distribution, I'm not touching any of this. If any of you think that some of these programs are wasteful, that's up to you. But so far as I'm concerned for this, if and you want to get rid of some program, that would be even more money. But I don't need to touch any of the existing welfare programs for the 20,000 rupees per year to each family that I mentioned about. And number 4 objection was I'm ignoring health, education, infrastructure. But remember, I'm giving out of the 10% GDP, I'm also spending on health, education, and GDP. And I'm almost finished now. Let me say, politically savvy people will immediately point out that elimination of long-standing subsidies and imposition of new taxes will meet a lot of resistance from many quarters, no doubt. And of course, it will be politically difficult to carry out. While that is true, since we are going through a crisis situation, as the cliche goes, a crisis is also an opportunity. The crisis situation sometimes may soften up the resistance somewhat, and may thus be thus be an opportune time to try big changes. If for some time the whole of the 10% of GDP is difficult to mobilize, even with half the amount, one can start a UBI supplement only for the women. With half the, if you can raise only half the money, give it only to the women. Let me now end with one or two other implementation issues. One implementation issue is this will require, of course, assuming everybody has some identification like Aadhaar card, etc. But the more important issue here is that not everybody has a bank account, or even when you have a Jan Dhan bank account, more likely that it is a dormant account. So this is why it may not be immediately implementable, but bank accounts have increased quite a bit in recent times. But until then, in remote corners of the country, you can use bank agents, etc., etc. So there are those kind of implementation problem. And the last implementation problem that I want to mention is that some people say, what about inflation? So don't you have to adjust the amount? Because otherwise next year prices have gone up. Yes, that is possible, but that's not difficult to do. For example, in India, people who get pensions get some cost of living adjustment. So you can adjust that accordingly. Let me end that. Let me end that here, because it looks like I have run out of my time. So I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Bardhan. And good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for missing out on at the beginning part for a real unexpected problem with Zoom. And thanks, Chitrakalpa, for the introduction. So several questions have already trickled in and are still coming in. So we'll look at those questions and I'll ask you a few of them. But let me start while others are busy typing in those questions. Let me take the moderator's privilege here and let me ask you a question. What do you think is the likelihood of UBI actually, I mean, the political economy possibilities around here and everything, likelihood of it coming either in the short run or in the next decade or so? Of course, India is very volatile, so to speak, so we don't know whether how it will shape up in a decade, and for any country, but more so for India possibly. But is there a fair chance of UBI coming into existence in a poor country like India, where it's most needed?
Maybe you may have, that was the first line I mentioned, which you may have missed. I said UBI is not for an immediate execution. There are lots of things. At the end, I mentioned about bank accounts, but there are other, you have to build institutions, you have to make preparation. So it's not in the short run. In any case, I must say that in the short run, the government's programs, compared to many other countries' programs, the government's programs so far have been quite stingy. So I don't expect the government to do it, although there have been some proposals by other economists who also support UBI, that why not, at the moment they have PM Kisan, which is 6,000 rupees, why not extend it to everybody? Instead of just farmers, extend it to everybody. And there have been some calculation that it will be manageable. It will not be that big an expenditure. But since you are asking a political question, my expectation is no, I don't expect this to be adopted in the immediate short run. My whole idea is to make people aware. You request a lot of, even economists need to work of various effects to work out how much it is. And also this implementation, institutional implementation issues need to be worked on. So no, it's not for immediate effect, but things happen only after lot of discussion, lot of calculation, lot of talking with political leaders, etc. Think of Enriga. Enriga came out, which year was it? 2004 or something. The act, the Enriga, and then its actual implementation was more like 2006 or 7. But people have been talking about this the previous 20, 25 years before. So an idea needs to be really discussed. So I think one should seriously take this into consideration for maybe the intermediate run. You mentioned 10 years, maybe in the 10-year horizon, this should be a very serious, one should give very serious thought to it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor. So let me pick a few of these questions. As I said, several of them have already trickled in, and I'll just help you edit through this maybe. And of course, you are also free to pick anything that that catches your attention in the Q&A box. But
I have
a lot of text to read there, so it's difficult to do that.
I'm not reading the text, so you
That's
may
right.
tell me.
Of course.
Not too many questions at one time because I'll forget.
Right. No, one at a time, maybe. Okay. So an interesting question here is that that these socially stigmatized work. Now, the question asked is, well, is it given the fact that UBI will not discriminate against socially stigmatized work, would that not provide incentives for socially stigmatized work? And is that a problem? Is that something that we need to at all worry about, or is that
I don't expect, if you think of socialistic, if you remember my examples, the first example, manual scavenging, do you expect anybody to do more manual scavenging just because even if you don't do anything, if you sit idly at home, money will come to you. So why is it an incentive to do any kind of work? I already said there's no substitution effect for this. So you don't have to do anything, not to speak of manual scavenging. It will not have to do anything for the UBI you get. So I don't think incentive to do stigmatized work is of much relevance. One example in my set of examples was sex work. If you are thinking that people will be induced to do sex work, I think you have the wrong idea. People will be induced to sex work because the basic income, because as I said, you're going to get basic income in any case, even if you don't do any work. So why would you do any kind of work, stigmatized or not non-stigmatized?
Thank you. So another question is, tax concessions and regressive subsidies if withdrawn, is there a possibility of capital flight, reluctance of firms to invest, which would be detrimental for the economy? I think it's part of that 6% out of which you took 1/3. That kind of an argument possibly.
No, but this can be applicable to even all fresh taxation also, because, and this is general argument, if you tax rich people, they're going to go away. My position is on that kind of an issue, if rich people wanted to do capital flight, they will do one way or the other. So I think that should not be given as a bogey. Therefore, we shouldn't tax more. In fact, let me give you an example from other countries. Indian tax GDP ratio is one of the lowest in the world. Even so, there's capital flight. We know about Swiss bank accounts and others, even though tax GDP ratio is one of the lowest. Tax GDP ratio in Brazil is nearly twice as India's. I'm not talking about rich countries. If we're talking about Sweden, tax GDP ratio there is about 50%. Yet Swedish capital is not flying away. Yes, there must maybe some amount of capital flight, but it's negligible. So I think that bogey should not be used for not taxing more. There is no excuse for inheritance tax in India to be zero. Rich people's children inheriting without paying any tax to society highly capitalist country like the United States has a inheritance tax. But India abolished inheritance tax in the 1980s. There's no argument in favor, capital flight or no capital flight.
So there's a question from my colleague, Professor Milindo Chakraborty, who asked, will UBI help reduce agricultural subsidies in US and EU? I believe he's talking about UBI there, not in India, and indirectly help farmers from developing countries.
I think I'm not talking about UBI in the United States. As I already said, UBI is financially not feasible in the United States. But in the regressive subsidies that the NIPFP has calculated, by the way, the work was done by my ex-student Sudipta Mandal. So some of the regressive subsidies are agricultural subsidies, like, for example, fertilizer subsidies. Fertilizer subsidies, if you read the studies on fertilizer study, major part of fertilizer subsidy go to the rich farmers. So yes, some of the agricultural subsidies will go down, and I'm actually in favor of reducing agricultural subsidies which are going to the rich farmers. Some poor farmers who are benefiting from agricultural subsidies, you can always tell them that you are going to get, if you give up this fertilizer subsidy in exchange, in return, you're going to get a much higher income, basic income.
So, and several of the questions have dealt with this equality issue, which I think you have already discussed, and so I'm not going to take that way. One second, just quickly going through. Now, one question is about how to make this, how to operationalize this at a policy level. Would this require is it just a budget announcement that can make it happen? Does it require something more fundamental, as inclusion in a more some way to tie the government's hands so as not to take it back? Is an NREGA kind of is it an act that would be needed? What would have you any thoughts on that, about how to make it?
As I said, I'm thinking of UBI not for the short run. So in the public discussion, the academics should work more on it to work out the various effects, the empirical studies to look at the various effects. I want, as I've already mentioned, the labor movement to take it up, both the formal workers organized by trade unions and the informal workers should. So it comes as it should not come from as a kind of some academics utopian idea. It should come from below. So and that's why I'm emphasizing, I want to make it as a part of the platform of the labor movement. Now, once it becomes a part of a labor movement, political movement, then people will come out with a lot more ideas about practical implementation. And it may not, it is not just one day's announcement. If you look at NREGA also came out of a labor movement. In fact, those who were actively involved, people like Aruna Rai and Jean Drèze and others, but there was this what was called Kisan Sangharsh Samiti in Rajasthan the Kisan Mazdoor Sangharsh Samiti. Now, so it was part of a labor movement that the demand was coming. So that, I think that makes it much more sustainable, not just some academics utopian idea. So one needs a lot more work on that. And secondly, the the way I'm thinking of funding it is by reducing, one of the ways is reducing regressive subsidies and regressive subsidies both at the center as also states. So it has to be a lot of discussion, a lot of consensus building with the state governments as well. So it requires a lot of time. It requires time in terms of kind of political, not everybody will agree, but some kind of political opinion building will be needed. And then, of course, then administratively. In some sense, basic income is administratively simpler. All it requires is a check going out. It doesn't check who is poor, who's not poor, who has the BPL card, Aadhaar card. Aadhaar card would be necessary because you need to find out who's a citizen, etc. But Aadhaar card should not be the only ID card, some ID card. But then bank account, I've already mentioned the problem of bank accounts. I think it will require some time in building the financial infrastructure of reaching out, the check going out to the poor to go to the remote areas. That will require some building of the banking infrastructure. So that all this requires some preparation.
Now, the regressive subsidies that you mentioned, withdrawal of those or direct or dismantling of some of them. I mean, I know this is all part of the movement that should gradually come in, but I'm sure you expect quite a bit of political reprisals coming from those interests that would be hurt.
That's what I said. I talked about the resistance. Sure, there will be doubt. And in the reason why I'm emphasizing labor movements, etc., that there will be opposition. So only if large number of people, formal workers organization, informal workers organization, and other NGOs make it a kind of a vocal demand, only that way you can try to fight that resistance that you're talking about. Of course, a lot of people will resist. But that's why one needs to build a kind of opinion building and political movements, social movements, to essentially to counter the resistance. Yes, it's not easy, and that's what I ended up with. It's not. There will be a lot of resistance, particularly if it's funded by more taxation and taking away some of the subsidies, which the better off people are now drawing from tax. Our taxpayers are funding those better off people, 6% of GDP.
So if we look at some global role models for India to follow, and you did mention Iran and Mongolia, and also Alaska, they are all natural resource funded efforts, it seems, as you mentioned. But even if not implementation of UBI, has any country progressed towards at least the general acceptance of the idea and the willingness of the country to reduce subsidies and increase taxes if needed to fund it? I mean, I'm sure others are more ahead of us. Is there any example that India could please look up to, or in this path?
As I said, experiments on this in many countries, but most of these are rich countries, and I'm not discussing rich countries. But in the case of Kenya, on which we now have the largest experience, for the last 10 years, this experiment is done in Kenya. But the experiment is more about finding out the effects. But the experiments are not about funding, because the Kenyan experiment is being funded by essentially by NGO. It's by an NGO movement. So on funding, there is not a great deal of experience outside rich countries. And this is also the reason why it will take time, because one is to find out which taxes will work and which taxes will not work. Which kind of reduction of subsidies will be easier, and which kind of subsidies, reduction of subsidies will not be that easier. So that's why we don't have many examples, but that's why I'm saying it will take time to work it out. It cannot be immediately implemented.
On a slightly broader issue, as you mentioned, that this would probably be best advocated through labor movements. We seem to think, or there's an impression that in India currently the labor movement is not as effective, vocal, organized, impactful, and so as a what are your thoughts on it? First, is this view something that you would share, and would this if weakened labor movement, would there be an appropriate vehicle to bring this idea to an adoption?
First of all, I'm coming to labor movement in a minute. Only labor movement, this is something civil society organizations should also take up, and because many of the programs for the poor, there are a lot of problems with those that I've already talked about, targeting problems, etc. But it should be a general demand, not just labor movement. But let me now come to labor movement. One of the reasons, as I've already mentioned, labor movement is weak because the labor movement represents only a small part of the labor force. It's at most 6, 7, 8% of the labor force that the trade unions are addressing. And even though they are weak, where are the strongest? The trade unions are strongest when the salaries are highest. So try to reduce the salaries of bank employees, the public sector banks. Their unions are quite strong. It's the lower down you go, it's weaker. Because the lower down is the large number, the vast ocean of the informal workers. So that's why I'm thinking of issues on which the formal and informal can unite. One reason the labor movement is weak because it's very small in number. But if you can mobilize much larger number on a particular issue, then I think the labor movement will be somewhat stronger. Labor movement in general is all over the world now is weaker than before, but in particular in India it's weaker because it represents a very tiny part of the whole workforce. So we need to think of issues. So for example, the universal health insurance, not just UBI, universal health insurance, I think should be a demand for everybody. And we are going the wrong way. We are having this Ayushman Bharat is essentially a private health insurance. It's not universal. First of all, it's only for certain sections of the people and no outdoor expenses. It's only for hospital expenses and so on. Try to, again, you have the same kind of problem. Universal healthcare requires a lot of money. Same kind of issues that I mentioned with universal. But universal basic healthcare should be a demand by everybody in India, particularly the poor. Those who have government jobs there and or private sector good jobs, they have health insurance. But the majority of the people don't have that. So it should be an electoral issue. Unfortunately, when it comes election time, the issues are quite often other issues about Hindutva, issues about national security, issues about Pakistan. It's never that the poor people's children are dying by the thousands every year because they don't have health benefits. Every year, thousands of poor people's children are dying in India, and that's going on for ages. That's not an electoral issue in India. What I think it's important to make these part of the election issues, not just issues of the other things about religion or fighting Pakistan. I'm not saying these are unimportant. I'm saying the very important basic things about our economic life, our health, are not part of electoral issues. I want us, civil society organizations, trade unions, all join in this kind of demand. We demand universal health insurance. You can see, look at the Punjab farmers movement, which are now blocking your road to Delhi. What is the movement about? Because they are worried about minimum support price, MSP. The Punjab farmers are worried about maybe the government, which is probably their government probably is not going to do it, but they're worried about the base of MSP is going to be weak. And that's major issue primarily for Punjab, Haryana farmers. And yet you see how important that movement is because they've organized. But on these basic issues of children dying out because of lack of health, where thousands of people are dying, is not an issue in India. Nobody marches, blocks roads for that. I want these issues to be part of a public discussion at least, and then part of political demand.
Thank you, sir. I think this is obviously this UBI thought and the idea which you have espoused for several years now, even if we started from your EPW article, and several other voices are joining the UBI argument side. But as you rightly pointed out, this is probably still in early stages in the development of the idea, and I mean the idea may be well fleshed out, but the convincing and the advocacy and making it happen is certainly going to be there's a long road ahead. But your presentation today obviously made a very convincing case, not only in pointing out that it is appropriate for the times and the nation, but the fact that this is hardly a new idea and roots of UBI go back to the days of even finding mention in Marx's writings about and John Stuart Mill's work. Let me, since there are not too many other questions trickling in, as well as the time I think is coming to a close, let me take this opportunity to thank you for making time for us in your busy schedule. Also, it must be quite late now now in California, and it's a matter of great privilege and honor for Jindal Global Business School and Jindal Global University to host you, sir. For everyone else, as you know, some of you are non-economists here, so we as the economists of our generation, my generation speaking, we have grown up on works of Professor Bardhan. I mean, he hardly needed any introduction to anyone, and not just in India. I myself had the privilege of having a, what should I say, one stage removed association, because I was an editorial assistant for a very brief while to Sebastian Edwards, who was at UCLA as a graduate student about 20 plus years ago. I used to help him out in the works of Journal of Development. He was a co-editor there, sir. And so Journal of Development Economics is certainly the leading journal of development economics. So in many ways, Professor Bardhan has been among the founders of the development economics movement, and his work on India, his work on income inequalities, his work on poverty, it's the bedstone of a lot of work, bedrock of a lot of work that happens in these areas. And so we are very grateful. This is a very special honor for us to host you, sir. And I would like to thank you again for taking the time on a late Sunday evening for you. And we would love to stay connected. And I think when things improve and travel becomes easier, we would look forward to hosting you in person at our campus in Sonipat. And thanks again, of course, to Chitrakalpa and to Anirban for making this all happen. An amazing set of lectures they have been putting together this year, leading to, if I may say, a climax of this lecture. So, so thank you to the organizers. Thanks to Karthik, who's providing great IT support right now, without which none of our meetings and conferences and seminars can happen these days. So thanks a lot. And so Professor Bardhan, thank you again for taking the time out for us.
Welcome.
Thank you, sir. Chitrakalpa, anything we need to do before we sign off?
No, I think that's it. And once again, thank you, Professor Bardhan, from all of us. And
Welcome.
We can thank you.
Welcome.
It was a
will there be a YouTube of this?
yes. We will share this link with you. The recording.
Okay. All right. Thank you for inviting
you,
me. Welcome.